Before we proceed to the mechanics of respiration, we need to understand the significance of respiration. I don't know whether we have asked ourselves a question of why do we breathe? Since when we were born, we are continuously breathing up till this time, and we will continue breathing until when we are dead. But why? Why are we breathing? For us to understand why do we breathe, we need to know that the human body or the human cells requires energy for them to work. You cannot talk without energy. You cannot walk without energy. You cannot carry anything without energy. You cannot read without energy. So all body cells requires energy for them to work. And this energy is provided in form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, or CP, creatine phosphate. This is the energy or the molecule our body recognizes as a source of energy. It's just an example like our vehicles, like our cars, they recognize petrol as their source of energy. Some recognize diesel as their source of energy. Our body cells recognize ATP or CP as their source of energy. Now, how is ATP produced? ATP can only be produced when there is oxidation or breakdown of food substances to generate these ATP. So when we take in food materials, such food substances will be digested, and the molecules like glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids will be released. And these molecules are the ones that will react with oxygen in order to generate ATP. So you can see, even if we continue eating without oxygen, ATP cannot be generated, because the food substances, the molecules, the nutrients like glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids must react with oxygen to generate ATP. And now our body will now use the ATP as the source of energy. So without oxygen, there will be no ATP, even if we continue eating. So that's why we required oxygen. And this oxygen can only be provided through respiration. And this is why we are breathing continuously until when our life is normal. So the breathing is to supply oxygen to all tissues in order to oxidize food substances to generate ATP, which is the energy source our body cells recognize. And during this process, waste material and gases like carbon dioxide are produced. And this carbon dioxide is toxic to the body cells, and it has to be removed from the body. So this waste material or the carbon dioxide can only be eliminated from the body also through respiration. So you can see respiration is significant in order to supply oxygen to the tissues for production of ATP, and also remove carbon dioxide from the body because it is toxic to the body cells. In addition to this, respiration also play an important role in other processes like temperature control in the body. So in a nutshell, this is the significance of respiration. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about the mechanics of respiration. What happens? What are the processes that are involved in respiration? And under this lesson, we are going to talk about respiratory muscles. We are going to talk about respiratory pressures. We are going to talk about respiratory or thoracic diameters. And then we are going to talk about mechanism of inspiration and mechanism of expiration. So in the beginning, as I mentioned, we are going to start with respiratory muscles. Respiratory muscles can be defined as muscles that are responsible for respiration, or muscles that usually contract during respiration. They are classified into two. We have muscles of respiration and muscles of expiration. However, because expiration is a passive process. So usually tidal expiration or normal expiration doesn't require any contraction of any muscle. And each type of these muscles, if we take muscles of inspiration, can also be classified into two. We have primary muscles of inspiration and accessory muscles of inspiration. Now, what are the primary muscles of inspiration? Primary muscles of inspiration are the ones responsible for a normal tidal inspiration. When we say a tidal inspiration, we mean when we are breathing normally. For example, now I'm talking and I'm breathing at the same time. So this is tidal inspiration or tidal breathing. When you are sleeping, you are still breathing. That is also a tidal breathing or quiet breathing. So these muscles are the ones responsible for such breathing, especially during the inspiration. Now these muscles are the diaphragm and then the external intercostal muscle. So that means before any tidal inspiration to take place, there must be contraction of diaphragm and contraction of the external intercostal muscle. That's why they are called primary muscles of inspiration. Without their contraction, inspiration cannot take place. What if somebody needs to breathe in with force? For example, if I want to take in a deep breath, the deep breath cannot be possible without help from other muscles, in addition to these primary muscles of inspiration. So, because the energy required is much, that's why this primary muscle of inspiration requires help or support or contraction from other accessory muscles in order to achieve a maximum inspiration. And these accessory muscles of inspiration include the serratus anterior, the levator scapulae, and the scalene muscle. They are the ones that assist the primary muscles of inspiration during forceful or maximum inspiration. So, in summary, muscles of inspiration are classified into two: the primary muscles and accessory muscles of inspiration. The primary muscles are responsible for normal inspiration, while the accessory muscles support or assist the primary muscles of inspiration during a forceful or maximum inspiration. So the next type or group of muscles are the muscles of expiration. However, as I said earlier, expiration is a passive process. What happens is that during inspiration, the muscles of inspiration will contract, and this will result to the expansion of the chest, of the lungs and chest wall. So because the lungs are elastic in nature, immediately after inspiration, they go back to their original position. And that's what we call the elastic recoil. So the normal expiration is due to the elastic recoil of the lung and chest wall. It's a passive process and doesn't require any muscle contraction. However, if we want to make a forceful expiration, we want to blow out a large volume of air, then we need support from muscles of expiration. They only come or they only act when we need to or during forceful expiration. So these muscles of expiration are the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. So in summary, expiration is a passive process. The tidal expiration occurs due to elastic recoil of the lungs and chest wall. It doesn't require muscle contraction. However, forceful expiration requires contraction of internal intercostal muscles and the abdominal muscles. Now, after talking about the muscles of respiration, we need to talk about the respiratory pressures. These are the pressures that exist within the chest wall and within the alveolar cavity. These pressures are, number one, we have the intrathoracic pressure. That is the pressure that exists within the thoracic cavity. You know, it exists between the wall of the lungs and then the chest wall. That's between the two pleurae. I don't want to take us into much details, but for basic understanding, the intrathoracic pressure exists within the thoracic cavity between the wall of the lungs and the thoracic cage. This pressure is always negative in relation to the atmospheric pressure. Usually after expiration and before inspiration, it is about minus 2.5 millimeters of mercury in relation to the atmospheric pressure. Why is it negative? We need to ask ourselves. It is negative in order to keep the lungs expanded, in order to prevent the lungs from collapsing. You know, a negative pressure is a sucking pressure. So it always allows air to flow in and air to remain within the lungs and prevent the lung collapse. Now, during inspiration, this pressure increase in negativity, meaning it will drop from minus 2.5 to about minus 6 millimeters of mercury in relation to the atmospheric pressure. And that will cause more expansion of the thoracic cavity and more air will now be coming into the lungs. Sometimes during a maximum inspiration, the intrathoracic pressure can be up to minus 10 millimeters of mercury in relation to the atmospheric pressure. Now, the next pressure is the intrapulmonary or intraalveolar pressure. From the name, it is the pressure that exists within the alveolar cavity. It also increases during expiration, meaning during expiration it becomes +1 because air is going out of the alveolar cavity. That is in relation to the atmospheric pressure. While during inspiration it becomes -1 in relation to the atmospheric pressure. So, in a nutshell, intrapulmonary pressure reduces during inspiration to allow air to come into the alveoli and increases during expiration in order to push air out of the alveoli and out of the respiratory tract. Then there is what we call transmural pressure, which is the pressure that exists along the alveolar wall. And usually it's the difference between the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrathoracic pressure. So in summary, the respiratory pressures are three. We have the intrathoracic pressure, which exists in the thoracic cavity between the wall of the chest and the thoracic cage. And this pressure is always negative. The average after expiration is about minus 2.5 millimeters of mercury in relation to the atmospheric pressure. During inspiration, it becomes more negative. It reduces to about minus 6 millimeters of mercury, which causes more expansion of the lungs and which cause airflow into the lungs. So also during forceful inspiration, it can become up to minus 10 millimeters of mercury, allowing maximum amount or volume of air to flow into the respiratory tract and also into the lungs. Then the next one is the intrapulmonary pressure, which exists within the alveolar cavity. That's why it is also called intraalveolar pressure. This pressure reduces during inspiration to about minus 1 millimeters of mercury in relation to atmospheric pressure and increases during expiration to about +1 millimeters of mercury in relation to atmospheric pressure. And difference between these two pressures, the intrapulmonary pressure and the intrathoracic pressure is called the transmural pressure. Okay, now we will be talking about the diameters of the thoracic cage. Now, if you look at the thoracic cage, it has about 3 diameters. If you look at it from upward, downward, that is what we call the superior-inferior diameter or the vertical diameter. Then, if you look at it like this, from left side to right side, that is what we call the transverse diameter. And then it also has the anterior-posterior diameter. So these diameters can change, especially during inspiration and expiration. During inspiration, usually the diameters increase because of the expansion of the chest wall. And during expiration, the thoracic diameters decreases, either as a result of the elastic recoil of the lungs or as a result of contraction of internal intercostal muscles and abdominal muscles. Now, after the discussions about the respiratory muscles, respiratory pressures, and then the thoracic cage diameters, now we will go into mechanism of inspiration and expiration. What happens during inspiration? What is responsible for inspiration? What happens during expiration? What is responsible for expiration? Now, during inspiration, as we have mentioned earlier, when the inspiration is normal, that means it's not forceful, there will be contraction of the primary muscles of inspiration. That is the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. Remember, the shape of the diaphragm is dome in shape, like this. So when it contracts, it becomes flat. When it contracts, it becomes flat. And by becoming flat, it has increased the vertical diameter of the thorax, meaning the superior-inferior diameter of the thorax. Now, the external intercostal muscles, when they contract, they pull the chest wall upward and then laterally. Upward and laterally, meaning they are increasing the transverse diameter as well as the anterior-posterior diameter. Now, increase in these diameters will definitely cause increase in the volume in the thoracic cage. So there will be expansion of the thoracic cage. And what happens if volume has increased? Usually if volume increase, the pressure in that cavity will go low. So now the intrathoracic pressure and the intrapulmonary pressure will all reduce. Usually the intrathoracic pressure will reduce to about -6 millimeters of mercury compared in relation to the atmospheric pressure, while the intrapulmonary pressure will reduce to -1 in relation to atmospheric pressure. So reduction in the pressure within the thorax and the alveoli will cause air to flow because there is less pressure within the alveolar cavity, there is less pressure within the thoracic cavity, so the lungs will expand and air will now come in from the atmosphere into the respiratory tract and into the lungs and into the alveolar cavity. So you can see inspiration has taken place, and this is the mechanism of inspiration. Contraction of the primary muscles of inspiration, increase in the thoracic cage diameters, increase in the thoracic cage volume, decrease in the pressures, and then air flow from atmosphere into the lungs and alveolar cavity. And for expiration, if you can remember, we said normal expiration, that is tidal expiration, is due to elastic recoil of the lungs. So at the end of inspiration, because the lungs are elastic and the chest wall, they have elastic properties, they return back to their original state or position. And by returning back to their original state, this will cause decrease in the thoracic cage diameter, decrease in the thoracic volume, and if volume decrease, there will be high pressure. Pressure will increase. So both intrathoracic pressure and intrapulmonary pressure will increase. And because there is high pressure within the alveoli and the thorax, the air will now go out of the lungs from the alveoli back to the respiratory tract and then to the atmosphere. So this is mechanism of expiration. During forceful inspiration, the only difference is, in addition to contraction of diaphragm and external intercostal muscle, there is also contraction of accessory muscles of inspiration. And during forceful expiration, in addition to the elastic recall, there is also contraction of abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles.